Thank you so much for joining us today. And this session is part of Prepared Together Canadian Red Cross Disaster Preparedness Virtual Learning Series. And today's session is presented in English. The spring and summer of 2024 have been bringing an unprecedented level of intensity for emergencies across the country. The goal of this learning series is to support people and communities to prepare for, increase their resilience to, and respond to future disasters. You can use the QR codes on your screen to visit our website to learn more about and register for our other programming in English and French. And we will also post the web pages for you in the chat. And just a few housekeeping items before we begin. Today's webinar is recorded and recordings will be sent to all registrants. Closed captioning is also available in both English and French. You can click the closed captioning button in your Zoom control panel. At the end of today's session, we will also have a Q&A period, so please leave your questions in the Q&A box in the control panel at the bottom of your screen. There will also be a feedback survey that launches on your browser once you exit today's webinar, and we really appreciate any input you might have on how we did today. Resource packages on all of our webinars from this series can be found at the link in the chat that I'm about to share. And all of our YouTube recordings can also be found at these links. And any questions about today's programming you have, you can email us at rrr@redcross.ca. And we acknowledge that much of our work in Canada is on the traditional, treaty, and unceded territories home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Each of us resides on the traditional land of the First Peoples of Turtle Island. Let us take a moment to acknowledge the shared history of Indigenous peoples and settlers in this land with the goal of reconciliation. Please take a moment and share in the Zoom chat where you are from or live today. Moments like this allow us to connect in the spirit of collaboration, friendship, and reconciliation to value the ways of being, knowing, and learning of all Indigenous peoples and nations across Turtle Island. So in the webinar chat, please tell us where you are joining us from today. Thank you, Tiara from Calgary, Alberta. Roman from Oakville. Thank you so much for doing that. And the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies has seen fundamental principles which we also honor in Canada. Interestingly, these principles align with the Indigenous peoples of Canada's 7 sacred teachings. Where I reside on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe peoples, these are also known as the grandfather teachings of wisdom, love, respect, bravery, honesty, humility, and truth. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Emily Rideout, who is our presenter for today. Thanks, Emily.
Thanks, April. I'm just going to pop my presentation up on the screen here. Please just give me a moment to get that sorted. That looking all right, April?
Looks good.
Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Rideout. I'm a senior manager with the Disaster Risk Reduction and Climate Change Adaptation team at the Canadian Red Cross. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm joining you today from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe in what is now known as Ottawa. So thank you for putting your land acknowledgements or your location in the chat. I'm also so curious to know where folks are joining us from in terms of what sector you work in. I assume you're here on behalf of an organization or a business, so I'm interested to know what is your organization or what kind of work does your organization do? And so if you're willing, I'd love to see that in the chat. So I'm curious. So this presentation is a condensed version of a 5-hour workshop on service continuity planning recently developed by the Red Cross. That full-length 5-hour workshop can be given in person or virtually. And if you'd like to arrange this kind of workshop in your community or for a network that you belong to, I invite you to reach out to that email address that April mentioned earlier, rrr@redcross.ca. So in this presentation, I will tell you what service continuity planning is and why it's important. And I'll give you an overview of the 6 steps of service continuity planning. So if we were doing the full-length workshop right now, there would also be worksheets and activities followed by group discussion, but today I'll be giving you just an overview of each step. So the presentation will be 45 minutes or less, and we'll have time for some questions at the end. So we developed this kind of workshop and this content for 2 reasons. Research showed us that small businesses and community organizations don't have a huge amount of capacity to do this kind of planning, and that there are a few resources out there that are suited to their contexts and their challenges. There's quite a few resources around business continuity planning for large corporations, international standards, and so on. But for smaller businesses and community organizations, there's less, like I said, tailored to their sort of capacity challenges and the fact that they're reliant potentially on more volunteers than traditional workforce and so on. And the second reason we created this content is because weather-related disasters are becoming more severe in Canada and they're happening more frequently. So this is the new sort of context we're operating in, and we wanted to create this content to help small businesses and community organizations become more resilient in the face of these disasters. So there's 2 learning objectives for today. I want to introduce you to the importance of engaging in this type of planning, and I want to provide you with an overview of the core components of service continuity planning, which will enable you to take at least a basic approach to service continuity planning for your organization. So what is a service continuity plan? Basically, it's a collection of information, policies, and procedures that is compiled before an emergency, and that's key. And the primary goal of a service continuity plan is to allow an organization to continue to deliver services that are critical to the organization's operations or to the community it serves, or both. And so this is in the context of a disruption, either continuing those services through a disruption or resuming them quickly as soon as normal or new normal conditions resume. So think about when COVID-19 showed up on the scene in Canada and in the world. It took organizations and businesses weeks to months to pivot to be able to resume offering services in that new environment. And so the idea here with service continuity planning is to plan for disruptions in advance so that you can resume service delivery as quickly as possible. So service continuity plans are not the same as emergency response plans. They don't address procedures for emergency lighting, evacuation, shelter-in-place protocols, first aid, etc. Service continuity planning is really about the continuation of service delivery. And they're designed to complement emergency plans and not replace them. So ideally, you have both robust emergency plans as well as service continuity plans. So why create a service continuity plan? Organizations and businesses are becoming more exposed to hazards across the board, whether they be sort of natural disasters, everyday hazards, or more civic hazards like cyber attacks. At the same time, communities really rely on the services provided by these organizations and businesses. And so it's really important to understand the risks facing your organization or business and how they affect your ability to deliver services, as well as the steps that you could potentially take to reduce these risks so that you can continue offering those services in a disruption. Doing this kind of planning is not only going to enhance your own organization's resilience, but also that of the community that you serve. And this is especially true for organizations whose work is centered around supporting underserved populations and whose demand for services often increases during a disruption. So having a robust service continuity plan can help your organization reduce impacts, including financial or material losses, strengthen internal and external communication processes during a disruption, reduce stress on staff and volunteers, and ensure that everyone understands their roles in bringing critical services back online, and can even help preserve your reputation within the community it operates in. So as I mentioned, there's 6 steps to service continuity planning that we cover in the full-length workshop. Step 1 involves getting organizational buy-in for doing service continuity planning. Step 2 involves identifying which services you offer that are critical and must continue to be delivered after disruption, and which can be paused, as well as identifying the things that support or enable those critical services. Step 3 involves assessing the risks to critical services and their supports. Step 4 involves identifying and prioritizing strategies to protect those supports. Step 5 involves documenting key information that you might need to access when you activate your service continuity plan. And step 6 involves training staff, doing exercises, and reviewing and updating the plan. And so to ensure that your plan stays up to date, we've cycle that you'll go through is up to date in terms of so on. So now I'd like to walk you through each of the 6 steps in a little more detail. So the first step is about getting buy-in from your organization to do service continuity planning. So to do this, we recommend having a service continuity planning statement, identifying a lead, and ideally securing an executive sponsor or a champion. So first off, establishing a service continuity planning statement, policy statement, apologies. A policy statement can really be the foundation for that establishes the project and confirms the organization's commitment to the importance of doing this kind of planning. Some information that you might want to consider including in a policy statement are a brief overview of what's contained in your plan or some of the strategies you've identified, why the service continuity plan has been developed, expectations of staff or specific departments or parts of the organization, and a commitment to keeping the plan up to date. And having this kind of policy in place is important because service continuity planning it's an ongoing activity. It requires time and resources to complete it and to keep it up to date. So it's important that this is well understood and acknowledged by your organization's leadership. And secondly, when you have leadership commitment and sort of organizational buy-in to service continuity planning, it makes it so much faster and easier to activate your organization's plan when a disruption happens. You don't need to go up the chain and get approval. You have something on paper that's ready to go, and everyone is aware of it. So after identifying a service continuity planning policy statement, you'll want to identify a lead. And I'm going to go ahead and just use the acronym SCP for service continuity planning for the rest of the presentation. So for a small organization, you may be able to have just a single service continuity planning lead, an SCP lead. This role will take on most of the plan development, the implementation, and the maintenance of the plan, but they can also serve as the key contact in the event of a disruption and can help with the activation of the plan. For a larger organization with several service lines or departments, you may want to consider establishing an SCP committee. And this committee can help the lead develop the plan and work through the different components of creating your service continuity plan. So they should be made up of representatives from the different departments or service lines to make sure that all parts of the organization are reflected in the planning. So when deciding sort of how many resources to dedicate to developing a service continuity plan, basically can you just manage with one lead, or do you need a committee? You may want to consider how large is your organization? How many employees do you have? Do you have a lot of different service lines or departments that require consultation during planning? Does your organization rely heavily on a lot of external relationships like vendors, suppliers, and other community organizations? Essentially, the more complex the services you offer, the more you might want to consider having a committee to support the lead. So the last part of getting organizational buy-in is securing an executive sponsor or a champion. This person would ideally be a senior manager, and their role is to advocate for the importance of service continuity planning across the organization, and also potentially to help secure resources to do the planning and to implement it if it's ever necessary. And you may want an executive sponsor to produce a statement that goes with your policy statement. And it can speak to some of the things that you see on the screen here. Essentially the importance of doing this. So that's step one. Step two is a really important step, and it's all about identifying which of the services of all of the ones that you offer, which are critical and must continue to be delivered when there's a disruption or resume quickly after disruption, and which can be paused until normal or new normal conditions are restored. And this step is also about identifying the things that support or enable those critical services. So the first part of this is identifying which services are critical and which are not. To help organizations do this, we recommend assigning a maximum allowable downtime, or a MAD score, for each service. The MAD score represents the maximum length of time that a service can be unavailable before it starts causing harm either to the organization or to the community that you serve. So I'll show you what that looks like. So these are some of the timelines that we have for identifying your maximum allowable downtime. So essentially you should, for each service, so start by listing out all of the services you offer, then identifying sort of which of these time frames applies to that service. Essentially, how long can it be down before it starts harming the organization's ability to continue to exist or the services offered to community. So the lower the MAD score, the more quickly the service needs to resume. So this is going to look different depending on the kind of service you offer. If you're running a soup kitchen, then providing meals to those in need will have a short MAD score, or short allowable downtime, before harm to clients occurs, maybe around 24 hours. Whereas a library, say, could potentially be closed for a week or maybe more without harm occurring. So it's all about finding out which of all the services you offer have the lowest MAD scores. And it's not important sort of what that score is. It's just about figuring out which have to resume the most quickly and which can wait a little bit longer. So as I said, start by listing all the services you offer, assign a MAD score to each, and then rank them from lowest to highest. And we recommend starting with your 3 most critical services to start this process. So the next step is, once you've identified your top 3 critical services, you need to identify the things that support or enable these services to exist. Essentially, what is required to carry out those services. So I'll give you an example in a second, but basically you're going to take your list of critical services and you're going to look at their support requirements. So do they need facilities or space, a specific kind of facility or space to run? Do you need certain equipment, personnel, whether volunteer or staff? Do you need access to data or records, suppliers or vendors, vehicles, and so on? Basically, what needs to be in place to actually deliver a service? So I'll give you an example. Let's say I'm running a food bank, and the food bank normally offers, let's say 10 services, and that might include delivering boxes of food to clients, making boxes of food available for pickup at the head office location, cooking class, a nutrition class, and shopping on a budget class, plus a few other services. You're going to assign a maximum allowable downtime to all of these services. And in this example, let's say my food bank has decided that providing boxes of food via delivery to clients is the most important thing. That's where the harm is really going to accrue if we don't get that back up and running right away. Everything else can be paused. So in this case, it's delivering food boxes to clients. So what are the supports I need to keep that running? In this example, I'm going to need food. So I need a supplier to bring food. I need dry storage and cold storage. I need a place to assemble food boxes. I need boxes. I need staff or volunteers and a vehicle to deliver the food boxes. There's some other things that I might need though. Cold storage relies on power. Do I need a backup generator? Staff and volunteers, I need a way to contact them. Am I able to access their contact information in the case of a power outage? So starting to tease out all of these little pieces that support my service, which in this case is delivering boxes of food to clients. So the next thing you want to do once you've listed your critical services and their supports is look for any themes. is there something that cuts across all of your critical services, like access to volunteers or access to a vehicle? So if you identify any supports that cut across multiple services, these are really priority supports. And you'll want to focus on these when we come to step 3, which is about risk identification, and step 4, where we're going to identify strategies to protect those supports. So the next step is step 3, assessing risk. So a vital component of building a service continuity plan is understanding the risks that you're exposed to and the potential impact that these risks can have on your ability to provide those critical services. So it's important to think of all kinds of risks, all kinds of hazards. So we've listed 3 kinds of hazards here, but they each encompass a large range of different hazards. So there's environmental hazards. These are what we tend to think of when we talk about natural disasters: flooding, fire, tornado, hurricanes, heat waves, earthquakes, extreme heat, and so on. There's also human-caused hazards. This can include cyber attacks, robbery, terrorism, protests, strikes, and that sort of thing. There's also everyday hazards. This can be just run-of-the-mill bad news, burst pipes, leaking roof, equipment failure, supplier didn't show up, and so on. So these are all important to consider. I just want to note that when you're thinking about environmental hazards, it's important to consider past instances of these in your region, but also how climate change might be affecting the severity or the frequency. I live in Ottawa. Tornadoes were uncommon, but they're now becoming more common. And so if I had a business or an organization, I would want to be paying some attention to tornadoes, even though they're uncommon in the past. So how do we do a risk assessment? So, while it's important to look at all the hazards that could occur in your region, it's the knock-on effects of the hazards that are going to affect your organization. And these should be the focus for planning. So this is what this all hazards risk assessment can help you do. So the risk assessment happen in your region, rather than trying to steps to identifying risk that are included in our full-length workshop. So first, you're going to identify the potential hazards that can happen in your region. And you could do this by looking at maybe old news articles. Maybe you have a lot of past experience of what is likely in your region. But you may also, as I said, want to look up information about how climate will change those in the area where you live. And you'll also identify the likelihood of that hazard happening. And this doesn't need to be a scientific or mathematical likelihood. It can just be a bit of a gut check of extreme heat is more likely than an earthquake, for example. Then you're going to identify what are the impacts to those critical services and their supports if that hazard occurred. And then you're going to combine your likelihood scores with your impact scores to get a risk score. And in the workshop, we go through this in a lot more detail. So on the next slide, I'll show you sort of what I'm talking about when I say likelihood and impact gives risk. So this is an example of a risk matrix or a risk heat map. And so if we're talking about, let's say, flooding, and flooding has a low likelihood of occurring, and let's say where I live, it's going to have a low impact. So we can sort of find our place on this matrix. And in this case, this would be a low risk scenario. But if the likelihood of flooding where I lived was really high, and because of where my business is situated, the impact is really high, then the risk is going to be really high. Now, these are the easy examples, but it's important to bear in mind the cases where the likelihood is low, but the impact could be really high. And this comes out as a medium, but it's important to not ignore these. COVID-19 was an example of this. It was fairly unlikely, or we believed it was unlikely. And so nobody was prepared for it, and it ended up having a huge impact. And things like earthquakes can also fall into this kind of category. So basically any of the hazards where you identify a high risk. So a hazard that has a high likelihood, high impact, giving you, a high risk using this matrix. This is where you're going to want to focus in step 4 when you're identifying strategies to protect the critical services and their supports. So that's where we're going to go next, step 4. So step 4 involves identifying and prioritizing strategies to protect your critical supports, your critical services and their supports during a disruption. So there is a long list of ways that you could do this, a long list of potential strategies, and it's all going to depend on what are your services and supports, what are those hazards that were the highest risk. But here are some examples of things that your organization or business could consider. You could identify an alternate work location. You could buy a generator. You could, in the example I gave, make sure that your boxes are stored off the ground, away from floodwaters, if flooding is a hazard you identified as high risk. You could cross-train staff so that they could complete or undertake other roles if, for, because of the disruption, some of your staff can't come into work. You can develop procedures for how you're going to communicate with staff and volunteers, like a phone tree. You can come up with communication strategies so that you can communicate with clients, volunteers, and the broader public. This could be social media, it could be email or telephone. Maybe contact lists of your key suppliers and vendors. A succession strategy, if for whatever reason related to the disruption, your leadership is unable to do the role they normally do. Data backup and storing information in the cloud. So if you can't access your normal facility, that you can still access that information. Maybe you want to maintain an inventory of goods and supplies off-site. You could identify alternate suppliers, and you can develop sort of pre-written canned messages for the media or for staff. All of this is designed to save time if there's a disruption. So the first step is to sort of brainstorm a bunch of strategies that could help protect those critical services and their supports. The next step is to prioritize them. You may come up with a huge list of strategies, but smaller organization. Oh, sorry, I jumped ahead. The next step is to think about a specific kind of strategy. And this is around basically working with other organizations, maybe in your region or in your sector, to share resources. Other organizations can be a huge asset in this kind of work. So even if organizations differ in scope or clients they serve or activities, you may be able to share resources. So this could include sharing equipment, sharing locations, like my location is flooded. Can I come to your location to assemble my food boxes? My fridges are down because I don't have power. Can I come use your fridges? Can I use your volunteers? And so on. And so a couple things to consider is that, you may want to find partners to share resources with outside of your geographic area. If you're experiencing flooding, you want to find a partner who's not experiencing flooding, hopefully. And it's also important that you sort of make these connections before a disaster happens. And you may want to use a sort of an MOU or a service agreement to establish like a good understanding of what you'll be exchanging and what kinds of scenarios beforehand. And so the last component of this step is about prioritizing those strategies. So initially you're going to come up with a long list of strategies, but because all organizations have limited resources, staff, time, money, partners, equipment, etc. The strategies that you implement need to have a strong cost-benefit ratio. Basically, they need to be feasible and they need to be effective. So a strategy is feasible, if the resources required to implement it, like staff, technology, cost, facilities, time, if it's affordable, if it's available, if it's relatively easy to implement, then you would say it's feasible. If it's expensive, difficult, requires a ton of staff, it's complicated, then it's less feasible. Likewise, a strategy is effective if it's going to directly and substantively reduce your risk or help you keep that service running. Basically, will it achieve real change or only marginal improvements in your ability to deliver that service? So again, you may want to start by brainstorming a long list of strategies and then using sort of, again, a matrix, not pictured here, of is it high or low feasibility, high or low effectiveness. And you can see on the screen here sort of some ways to think about this. So if a strategy is highly effective and highly feasible, this is low-hanging fruit or an easy win. Do these ASAP. If a strategy is highly effective but not very feasible, you should still do it, but it may take some planning to decide how you're going to do it, to assemble resources and so on. If a strategy is highly feasible but not very effective, this is something you should do as resources allow. Maybe you have a summer student, maybe you do it in your spare time. If something is not very feasible and not very effective, do not do this strategy. So that's step 4. So now that we have, once you've completed this step, you have some strategies that have been prioritized and you've given some thought to how you can work with other organizations in your sector or your region. The next step is to document a lot of information. So you want to document, I'll tell you about some of the things you might want to document. But you want to document this so that you have a lot of information at your fingertips when a disruption happens. And you want to make sure this information is accessible to you. So maybe it's stored in the cloud, or maybe you have a backup physical copy somewhere. And so this is so that you don't have to spend time tracking down all this information when things are going awry. So examples of what you could document here in your plan. You can have an activation guide. This is a decision tree that helps you understand when you're going to activate some of the strategies you've identified. You may want to list contact information for key staff and volunteers, for clients, for vendors. You may want to list contact information of your internal comms people, or backup comms people, as well as media contacts, if that's relevant to your organization. You may want to, as I mentioned, develop some pre-prepared communications messages to inform employees, volunteers, suppliers, what's going on. Contact information for any municipal, provincial, or territorial agencies that maybe you get support from or you report to. Staffing and volunteer plan. So basically procedures for identifying alternates for key positions, delegation of decision-making authority or financial authority. If you have identified an alternate location, where is that information? And then you may want to list info about specific assets, like if there's a generator, where is it? Where is the fuel for it? Is there a manual for it? Is data backed up in a specific location? Do folks need to know where that is? Do you need defibrillators or first aid kits, or whatever asset that you may have? Laptops, do you need to know their their asset ID number and where they're located? All this kind of thing. Basically, what do you want to know in the case of disruption so you don't have to go digging for it in the moment? So that's step 5, really just about recording information. And the last step is all about implementing the plan, testing it out. So basically, once you develop your first plan, you need to, of course, seek approval from senior management, and you need to socialize it across the organization, and you need to train folks if there's any specific strategies, or say like the phone tree, or on alternate authorities, and so on. This is really key. If you write the plan and it just sits on a shelf and nobody's seen it and nobody knows what to do with it, it's not going to be that useful. You may also want to do some exercises to test out a scenario to see sort of, do you have the information you need at hand? Have you implemented all the strategies that you may want to or may need to? You also want to make the plan accessible to folks. Again, if it's just printed in one binder in one location, and there's a fire at your location and nobody can access it. So it's really important that it is accessible either in the cloud or in a secondary location. Also, just a little note on sort of privacy. Not necessarily all employees or volunteers need access to the plan if it includes confidential information or contact information, but you do need to determine who does need access to the plan. So, like I said, exercising your plan, testing out a scenario can be a really great way to figure out if you've missed anything. Trial by fire is rarely successful. So you definitely want to try and exercise it at least once before anything happens. There's different kinds of exercises. You can review the plan. You can do a walkthrough with a group of people, ask folks to sort of poke holes in it. You could do an organizational exercise where everyone's actually on site, running through a drill sort of physically and in person. Or you could do a tabletop exercise where you say, okay, this is our scenario. What would happen in this scenario? And you walk through, rolling out your plan. And of course, it's important to keep your plan up to date. So we recommend sort of annual review of the plan. And if you do any organizational exercises or tabletop exercises, or if you experience an actual disruption, it's really valuable to do an after-action review. Basically, what part of our plan worked well, and are there any gaps that we may want to fill for the next disruption? And this is really key because, it says here, no plan is perfect the first time around. You don't necessarily think of everything. And so testing it and reviewing it on a regular basis is really important to making sure that it's a good plan. So to summarize, these are the 6 steps of service continuity planning. So we have basically getting organizational support, identifying your critical services and their support, assessing risk to your organization, identifying risk reduction and continuity strategies, potentially reaching out to other organizations in your sector or your area, and prioritizing risk reduction and continuity strategies. Step 5 is about documenting as much information as you can so that you have it on hand during a disruption. Step 6 is all about implementing the plan, doing drills or exercises, reviewing the plan, and keeping it up to date. And so, as you can see, this is a cycle and should be sort of, kicked off probably on an annual basis, if not more often. So, this is a short version of the service continuity planning workshop. When you do the full workshop, or maybe you're feeling this way right now, it can be a lot of information to consider. It does take some time to do this kind of planning. It takes getting leadership and organizational buy-in, consulting with different parts of your organization to understand what services they offer, making choices about what is a critical service, and getting that buy-in that everyone's on the same page that, look, we're going to protect these 3 things, and these other 3 services are going to have to go on hold for a time. So it can be a lot. It takes some work. So if this feels overwhelming, just start by identifying, like I said, your sort of top 1, 2, or 3 most critical services and their supports. For the risk assessment, you don't necessarily have to do a robust analysis with scores and multiplying things with matrices. Just think about, what are some of the natural disasters or human-induced or everyday hazards that you've experienced in the past? What keeps you up at night? And how would that affect the organization? Write it down. And then identify some strategies that can help. You don't have to identify absolutely every strategy under the sun right off the bat. Anything that you can do, to keep those services running will be an improvement and a good thing. And you can keep coming back to it. Maybe you want to start with biting off a little piece, and just every month you're going to sort of keep working through this process until you have a bit of a plan. So that's a summary of service continuity planning as we've conceived it in this more full-length 5-hour workshop that I mentioned off the top. I also want to tell you about another program that the Canadian Red Cross has just released that might also interest you and is a little related to this work. It's called Ready Rating. It's a free, user-friendly web platform, and it's designed to help businesses and organizations do emergency preparedness planning. Basically, it helps evaluate the state of your emergency preparedness planning, gives advice on sort of where to improve, and has a huge resource library that can help implement those improvements. You can access Ready Rating at readyrating.ca. Like I said, it's free. And so, as I mentioned earlier, doing emergency preparedness planning goes hand in hand with service continuity planning. It's challenging to have continuity of services when, you've experienced an emergency and it's not gone well, and maybe there's been impacts to your facility or impacts to your staff. So that emergency preparedness planning is very important. So just wanted to put in a pitch for readyrating.ca. And so I'll wrap it up there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm happy to take some questions. So if we don't get to your question today, or like I said, if you're interested in having a workshop for your region or your network or for your organization, please contact us at rrr@redcross.ca. So I'm happy to take some questions. April, I think you're on mute.
Thanks, Emily. So also to just announce the next webinar coming up in English. It's Tuesday on caring for self and others, and it's a 90-minute webinar. And if you'd like to join us, you can visit our QR codes to register. And I'm just going to open the chat box to see if there are any questions. We have kudos for an excellent presentation and some thank yous. And someone asks, if your organization supports other communities, is it recommended to ID their hazards as well as your own?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's really about like identifying what is that service, and is the ability to deliver that service impacted at your location or at their location? And if it's both, then you need to look at the hazards for both. And of course, looking at region-specific hazards. It depends on how far apart you are, but if you're in Calgary and you're supporting people outside Quebec or something, you're going to obviously want to look at those hazards. They are not the same.
That makes sense. Okay, and can we find this PowerPoint on your website link that you shared?
I guess that's a question for you, April. We'll be putting up the recording.
Yeah,
I'm not sure about the deck though.
Yeah, the recording will be available, and if Emily, you are willing to share the deck with participants, we will also post that on our website on our resources page that I shared.
Happy to do that.
Great. Any suggestions for how to build strong collaborative partnership?
Yeah, so I assume this is in reference to, well, maybe I should ask a clarification question. Are you talking about sort of internally collaborating on service continuity planning, or collaborating with other organizations to sort of share resources? You can clarify in the chat if you like, but I'll speak to collaborating with other organizations to share resources. This, I would really look to the organizations. Okay, I see your clarification. I would think about the organizations you maybe already have relationships with. You may be a part of a network, a chamber of commerce for your region, or a network of emergency managers, or small business groups in your region. These are groups that you could potentially reach out to and say, hey, look, we're engaging in this kind of planning. We've identified that we really would love access to another location. We have these assets that we could share. For example, we have a meeting room, we have a vehicle fleet, and whatever, a green space, and a parking lot. Who knows? Whatever you have, you could reach out and say, look, this is what we have to offer, but we're looking for anyone who could share with us. We understand that this is a great strategy for building resilience. Would anyone like to sort of set up an agreement or start a conversation about it? I think really tapping into those networks. So as I mentioned, you could potentially reach out to agencies that do something similar. So if I'm a food bank, are there other food banks? Or if you offer a similar service but to a different demographic, I provide psychosocial supports to youth, and your organization provides psychosocial supports to seniors. Is there, you may have a bond already, right? Like a shared mandate or objective of community service. So I think that's where I would start. Yeah, I think it really depends on sort of who are you in a relationship already.
Definitely. Christine asks, I've heard others distinguish between continuity planning and contingency planning. How do you define the differences and those boundaries?
Yeah, I would say that they're roughly similar. I think they both are trying to get organizations to think about different sort of disasters or emergencies that can happen and come up with plans for what you're going to do in that case. So a contingency plan. In this case, service continuity planning, like I mentioned, is really focused on the continuity of service, particularly for community serving organizations or small businesses. So I think they're functionally the same thing. As I mentioned earlier, service continuity planning is a bit different than business continuity planning. It's sort of, they all share the same foundational concepts, the same sort of goal of getting things up and running as quickly as possible. Service continuity really is about reducing harm to the community served and less about the rapid resumption of profit generation or business growth. But that's I think whether you're sort of community serving or a for-profit business, these concepts all apply, and they're roughly similar.
Yeah, great. And Emmanuel asks, what can we do in situations where we have limited resources to combat multiple disaster occurrences?
Yeah, this is a tough one. And climate change, I think, is bringing what we call compound disasters potentially, where you have a flood followed by a heat wave, and you're trying to tackle both at once. This is really tough, but this is where this planning can be so helpful, I think. Recognize that it does take time to do this planning and some resources. But when you're looking at those hazards, looking at all the potential hazards that can happen in your region and identifying the highest risk ones is, that's what you should be planning for. And so if you've planned for flooding, you can activate some of those strategies. And then there's a heat wave. Well, you've also thought of that and you can activate those strategies. Ideally, those strategies dovetail. It's tough if one set of strategies has you on site, but the other disaster means that you have to be off site. So, it sort of comes down to weighing like what looking at the conditions and saying, well, look, we can't access our site, so we need to activate our alternate location. But I want to acknowledge that can be so tough when you just have back-to-back disasters. That's so tough. But really I encourage folks to do this planning ahead of time and to really lean into that sort of resource sharing component. It's hard to tackle everything on your own, especially as a smaller organization. I really encourage you to try and reach out to other groups to find out whether you can share resources. I really think that there's a great strength in community resource sharing.
That's great. Thanks, Emily. And I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. This is sort of the last call. And again, you can continue to find us at rrr@redcross.ca if something comes to you after the session. And there's also a feedback survey that will pop up on your screen when you exit the webinar to give us any further feedback that you have. So I'm not seeing anything else coming through, so I think we'll call it. And thank you so much again, Emily, for presenting, and thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.